It's week 4 of our series called Big Picture, where we're taking a look at the life of Joseph. Joseph's got this really wild and crazy story in the book of Genesis where he goes through the ups and downs of life, where things go well and then things don't. And we've been really, the first 3 weeks, diving into parts of Joseph's story that really Joseph had to be asking, what's the point? He's struggling, he's going through he's been on the top and now he's been in this steady decline. And really, we're going to find him at rock bottom this week. And it would make sense for him to ask the question of God, what's the point of all this? And you know what I'm talking about, because we've all had those experiences where we've asked that same question. What's the point? Why do I have to go through this? Why does life have to be this way? We have that experience at school, especially when we're studying stuff that we're never going to use again. I can't remember the last time I used calculus in anything, which I took in high school, but what was the point? There's probably times during this shutdown that you've also at your house asked what the point. Like, my wife likes it when the house is picked up, but it's just going to get messy again. Why do we have to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning? We've got nowhere to go. Let me sleep in. But really, that question comes up most of the time when we're really dealing with some serious stuff. Like when you're dealing with disappointment, when you didn't make the team, when your friends are gossiping about you, it makes you say, what's the point of all this? What does the big picture really look like in all this? And it really gets even more difficult when we deal with painful situations. Like when somebody that we're close to deals with an illness or ultimately even death. When we struggle with anxiety and depression. In those moments, the question of what's the point become really difficult to wrestle with. And so in the middle of those difficulties, it can get really hard to see the big picture. We can get so stuck in this really small view of what life is just in our current circumstances where we totally miss God's big picture. And when we're missing that big picture, that's when we really start to ask, what's the point? And so today we are looking back at Joseph, about the story of Joseph. And as we've said over and over, we have the benefit that when we open Genesis, we can flip to the end of Joseph's story. We can see how it plays out. But Joseph is stuck, just like we are, in his own situation, in his own circumstances. The things that are going on in Joseph's life, that's all he can see. He can't see the big picture. He can only see what's going on right in front of him at that time. And so we have followed Joseph's story from him being his dad's favorite son, to angering his brothers, to his brothers throwing him into a well, and then in selling him into slavery. We've seen Joseph go into slavery and then be brought up by a government official called Potiphar. And we've seen Joseph get thrown in jail because of a lie Potiphar's wife told about him. We've seen Joseph do the right thing over and over. We've seen him make the right choices and do the things that really he should have been doing, and he's still in jail. It would be easy for him to ask that question of God, what's the point? And it's difficult to really understand why Joseph even continues to have faith in God, let alone just doing the right thing. So today we're picking up with Joseph while he's sitting in jail. And while he's sitting in jail, he is thrown in jail with 2 other guys from Pharaoh's court. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. 2 of his servants are in jail with Pharaoh. We've got the baker and the cupbearer. Now, I would imagine that you can probably figure out what the baker's job was. He baked. But the cupbearer, you might not be as familiar with what the cupbearer did, but what the cupbearer did for Pharaoh was he was one of Pharaoh's most trusted people that would drink from Pharaoh's cup before Pharaoh did to make sure it wasn't poisoned. And so with that background information, let's get into our story today. While they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." See, dreams back then were more than just weird things that you thought about while you slept. Sometimes they could be prophecies. They could be things that told the future. And what God was doing through Joseph is that God had given Joseph the ability to interpret dreams. So what happens with the cupbearer and the baker is the cupbearer brings this dream to Joseph and he says, Joseph, tell me what's going to happen. And what Joseph says is that after 3 days, Pharaoh's going to come back and put you right back in your spot. You're going to be restored. Good news. And then the baker hears that and is like, oh, great. I've got somebody who can tell me what my dream is. And so he comes and Joseph says, in 3 days, you're going to be executed. Now, I know I'd rather be the cupbearer in this situation than the baker, but all Joseph asks of the cupbearer once he gets released is, remember me. When you get put back in Pharaoh's court, remember me and help me out, man. And so this is what happens. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Two things that I think are important in this story. One is that God was right. Everything that God did through Joseph in Egypt, the dream interpretations that he gave, God was right on the money. And the other thing is that Joseph was still forgotten. Joseph did all the right things. He used his gifting, the things that God had given him to be able to do. He used them the way he was supposed to, and he's still forgotten. Another point in Joseph's life where it makes total sense to say, what's the point? In fact, he's going to be forgotten for 2 whole years. Now, to somebody as old as me, 2 years doesn't seem that long ago, but think what you were doing 2 years ago from now. 8th graders. Y'all were the 6th graders at that point. We had just gone through your confirmation service. You'd been baptized, you'd stood up in front of everybody and done the I Promise to Support First Broad Street with my prayers, presence, gift, service, and witness. And summer's fixing to start. 7th graders, 6th graders, y'all are still on the 2nd floor with Miss Katie. 2 years is quite a bit. And think about it this way. What are you going to be doing in 2 years from now? 6th graders, you're going to be in the same position the 8th graders are. 8th graders, y'all are going to be going into your junior year of high school. 2 years is a lot of time for Joseph to sit in jail and be forgotten. But what happens is that Pharaoh has a dream after 2 years. And nobody in Pharaoh's court can tell him what's going to happen. And in that moment, the cupbearer's like, oh yeah, I've got a guy who told me what was going to happen. And his prediction was spot on. And so the cupbearer tells Pharaoh, Pharaoh calls Joseph, and God helps Joseph to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours. After all of Joseph's struggles, after being enslaved, after being thrown in prison, after being abandoned and forgotten, finally, Joseph gets some good news. But this story isn't just about Joseph getting good news. It's not just about Joseph getting that happy storybook ending. It's about the big picture. That despite all of Joseph's struggles, despite all the hardship he's faced, despite the rejection, the anger from his brothers, his being imprisoned, his being forgotten, despite all of this struggle, God is creating a better future for Joseph. Joseph couldn't see it in all the struggle, but we're getting into the good part of the story where we finally get to see what God is doing, how God is working behind the scenes to create a bigger picture for Joseph in his life. It's the story that we see played over and over in Scripture. It's how God works. God doesn't just work in the small moments. He does, but God is working towards something bigger than we could possibly imagine. In our own redemption stories, in God's wooing us to Himself, in God creating a way for us to have a relationship with Him, God's working a bigger story. It's true in our circumstances as well as Joseph's. That when we go through difficult times, when we struggle, when we question, when we doubt, God is always behind the picture doing something bigger than we could possibly imagine. When we trust in God right where we are, in the circumstances that we find ourselves in today, when we trust that God is working for our best, when we can't see the big picture, trust that God is working for your good. So how do we do that? What does it look like for us to trust in God's big picture and the things that God is doing behind the scenes for our good? Because that is who God is, and that is what God is doing for all people who love God. God is working their good. And so what do? One, I think we exercise faith. That looks like a daily and probably an hourly practice of choosing to believe in God's goodness. Because faith isn't always something that just happens. It's like any other thing in life. It's got to be practiced. It's how God works. It's finding faith in that God is working something good. This is what I believe about God, about how God works behind the scenes. I don't believe that God threw Joseph in that well. I don't believe that God forgot about Joseph in prison. I don't think God forgets about us or causes our pain in our circumstances. But what I do believe about God is that God can take those circumstances and work good out of them. God doesn't create pain, God doesn't create struggle in our lives just to create struggle. That's not how God works. God takes the moments in this life where the world crushes us, where we get beaten down and we get forgotten. God takes those moments and brings about good from them. So the second thing we've got to do is we've got to look for that good. In those moments of struggle, in those moments of pain, we've got to open our eyes and try to find those moments, those places where God is working and bringing about good in our lives. In those moments of difficulty, what we've got to do is take a step back and look at the whole picture. Not just look at the circumstances we find ourselves in that moment, but we've got to step back and look at the big picture. When we do that, I think we can learn a lot about ourselves. We can learn a lot about the people around us. We can learn a lot about our world. And we can learn a lot about who God is. And even though we may not always feel the good, maybe we don't always see the good, look anyway. You might surprise yourself with what you find. And the third thing that we've got to do is to seek encouragement. You are surrounded by people here at our church and in your family by people with stories. People with stories who have experienced something very similar to Joseph. It might not be as drastic as Joseph's, but you have people, small group leaders, the adults in your life who have stories about how God has worked to bring good in their life through struggle. And what you've got to do is seek out those stories, to hear those stories and let them encourage you. Because when you can't see the big picture, trust that God is working for your good. And as we meet this week over Zoom, the question that I want you to be thinking about is this. What's one situation in my life right now that doesn't make sense? And we'll see you this week on Zoom.